All right, welcome to part 2 of the helicopter tutorial. Basically just gonna start right where we left off in part 1. So like I said, the next thing I'm gonna do is get it so that the player can walk up to the helicopter and press F, and then he'll get in. So to do that, we need to first create some input bindings. So up here at the top, you can hit Edit and select Project Settings, and then on the left, select Input, and we'll get access to our action mappings and our axis mappings. So we want to add an action mapping for entering and exiting vehicles. So I'm going to hit the little plus button, and then I'm just going to call this, I'm just going to call it enter vehicle, but technically it's going to be used for entering and exiting vehicles. And then I'm going to change the name of it, or the key, I'm going to change it to F, but feel free to use whatever key you want. And then while we're here, we might as well set up the other bindings for the helicopter itself, like how to control the helicopter. There's only a few of them. So the first one we want, and we want to add this to axis mappings, not action mappings. So make sure you're under axis mappings now, and hit the plus button. And we're going to call this the heli throttle. So basically how fast the blades are spinning. And we're going to set it to W for up, and this is going to be a scale of +1, so make sure you got +1 here. And then we're actually going to add another one for S, and it's going to have a scale of -1. So what this is going to do is whenever you hold down the W key, it's going to be giving us +1 for the throttle, and whenever we're holding down the S key, it's going to be giving us -1 for the throttle. So that will allow us to throttle up and down the rotors. And then we want two more. We want one for the turn, like how to turn the helicopter. So hit the axis mapping button again, and we'll just call this heli turn. And I'm going to bind this to the X mouse, so mouse X. So it's basically if you move the mouse left and right. And you can totally change up how these mappings are set up. I know a lot of people like a lot of different configurations for how helicopters work, but I would probably recommend just following along with the tutorial until you get it totally working before you go and switch these around to something that you want, because I know it's pretty controversial in terms of what the best flight controls are. But anyways, mouse X is going to set it to +1, and then the final one we want is the heli pitch, and I'm going to bind this to the mouse Y and set it to +1 as well. All right, so this is all of our input bindings. The only one we're going to really mess with right now is the enter vehicle, because that's the first thing we want to get set up is entering vehicle. So we can close the project settings and come back to actually we're going to hop into the characters blueprint first. So select your character, or open your character blueprint, whichever one it is. For me, it's just this template third person dude. And inside of here, we're going to add some code that basically says, hey, am I overlapping with the helicopter? And if I am, then let me enter it. Oh, actually, there's one thing we need to do before we can actually write this code. We need to come back to the helicopter and add some little collision boxes on the side so that the player knows when he's close enough to interact with it. So let's actually do that real quick. So up here, select the body, and we're going to hit add component again. Oh, actually, one thing we should probably do is we don't actually really want this default scene root. So if you just drag the body and drag it on top of the default scene root, you'll see it'll pop up and it says drop here to make the body the new root. And that's what we want to do. So we just want to drop it there, and I'll kind of replace it and make the body the root, because we don't need that default scene root for anything. But anyways, select the body, and we want to add a box collision. And this will be called like our enter box. So basically, if the player is inside of this box, then he's able to enter the helicopter. And again, by default, it adds it down here. We want to add it to the left side of the helicopter. Drag it up like so, put it over here. I'm just going to kind of do this really fast, change the size of it a little bit so it's a little bit bigger, something like that. And I actually had it on both sides. So if you right click and say duplicate and drag the duplicated one to the other side, now we can get in from both sides of the helicopter. And make sure that the collision for these is set to overlap all dynamic, which it should be by default. And I'm also going to rename these so they're enter box left and enter box right, just so we know which one's which. All right, so now that we have the collision volume set up, we can come back to our third person character, and write the code to actually get in the helicopter. So we want to trigger this code whenever they press the F key or whatever key you have set to enter vehicle. So right click and say input action enter vehicle. So this event is going to get called whenever they press that key, whatever it might be. And the first thing we want to do is we want to check which actors we're overlapping with. So let's say drag in our capsule component and we'll say get overlapping actors. And just a disclaimer, there's like 1,000 different ways to detect if the player is trying to get in the vehicle. This is just an easy one. So if you have another system already written in your game for interacting with things, then maybe you want to use that. Because at the end of the day, we're just going to get the helicopter that we're close to and say enter. But if you don't have any, then this will work fine. So get overlapping actors. We want to check if the length is greater than 0, which is basically just saying, hey, are we actually overlapping with anything? And if that's true, and to create this branch, I held down B and left clicked. You can also just right click and search for branch. Sometimes I do things really quick because I forget, because I'm so used to doing it. But anyways, get the overlapping actors, check if the length is greater than 0. We want to hook this up to pressed. So it's basically just checking to say, hey, what are we overlapping with as the player? And as long as we're overlapping with something, then we'll get past this branch. And we want to check if the thing that we're overlapping with is the helicopter. So for now, I'm just going to say get a copy of the first thing we're overlapping with, and we'll check if that's a helicopter. So to do that, we can just say cast to BP helicopter, and we'll drag this up. Oh, one thing we should do as well. Over here in the class filter, we want to change this to BP underscore helicopter. So that way it's only going to return to us actors that are of type BP helicopter. So once we get sub-0, we need to cast it to a helicopter just so we can get access to its members, but we know that it's going to be a helicopter because we have the filter here set to helicopter. So we can actually convert this to a pure cast. If you right click on this little blue node and say convert to pure cast, then it gets rid of the execution pins because we don't really, we know it's not going to fail, so there's really no need to check. And then we want to take this and promote it to a variable. So this is basically the helicopter that we're trying to get into. So I'm going to rename this to occupied helicopter and hook that up to the true. And then, so now that we have the helicopter that we're trying to get into, we want to, first of all, we want to remove collision from the player because we're going to put the player inside the helicopter. And if we try to do that while the player still has collision, the engine's going to kind of freak out because it's going to say, oh, the player's inside of the helicopter and the collisions are going to fight with each other. So we want to remove collision from the player. So drag in the capsule component and say set collision profile name, and we want to set it to no collision. And I guess one thing to note is if you want to have the ability for your player to like get shot while he's inside of the helicopter, then you're going to have to do a little bit more than this. You probably are going to want to create a custom collision channel for your character when he's inside of the helicopter. And that channel, you'll need to set it up so that he doesn't collide with the helicopter, but he still collides with bullets or grenades or whatever is causing him to take damage. But for the sake of this tutorial, since we don't have any of that type of stuff, I'm just going to set it to no collision. But you might need to do a little bit more for your game depending on what you want. All right, so now we have no collision. We want to enter the helicopter. And to do that, we're actually going to write that code inside of the helicopter class. So I'm going to come back to the BP helicopter, and I'm going to go over here to functions. I'm going to add a function called enter. And this function, we want to take in a couple things. We want to take in the player that's trying to enter. So select the enter, and then over here on the right, under inputs, add a new parameter. And we want it to be of type third person character or whatever character you're using in your game. So whatever type your player character is, and we'll just call this player. And then the other thing we want to take in is a delegate for when he exits the helicopter. And if you don't know what a delegate is, it's kind of like a pointer to a function. So we basically want to allow the user to, whenever they call enter, we want to give them a the chance to bind delegate to an onExited function that will get called whenever they exit. And that'll make more sense here once we code it, but I just kind of wanted to explain what it was. So to do that, we need to create an event dispatcher. I promise it's not as confusing as I probably just made it sound. We're going to create an event dispatcher, and it's going to be called onExited. And over here, let's drag this in, and when you drop it, you'll get some options here, and we want to bind to it. So select the bind and hook this up. And if you drag this event over here, it will add the pin to the node automatically. And I'm going to rename it just for clarity and call it the exit dispatcher, or delegate, sorry. And again, this will make more sense kind of once we get it working. But for now, just go ahead and do this, and I'll explain it once we get it working. And we want to save a copy of this player. So I'm going to right click and promote to a variable. Hook this up. I'm just going to double click to create some reroute pins here to make it a little easier to see what's going on. All right, so now the player has pressed the F key, and we've called enter on the helicopter that he's trying to enter. We should probably rename this to, what should I call this? Occupied player. I think that's what I called it in my other one. Let me double check just so I can kind of stay consistent here. Yeah, occupied player. And then we enter the vehicle, or we request to enter the vehicle. We bind to this exit delegate event, and then we save the player that's trying to enter into the helicopter, which again is us because we're inside of the helicopter. And the next thing we want to do is we want to make it so that the mouse and the keyboard are no longer controlling the player, but instead they're controlling the helicopter. And to do that, we need to change what the player controller possesses. We need to change it from the character to the helicopter. And it's pretty simple to do that. We just need to drag off our occupied player here. And actually, I'm going to call this occupant. Occupant. So the person occupying the helicopter. Drag off of this and say get controller. Get controller. And we want to say possess. And the thing we want to possess is our self. So you can just right click and say get ref to self. Select this guy and hook that up. And so what this has done is it's removed, it's changed it so when you interact or when you press buttons on the keyboard or you move the mouse, that input is now going to the helicopter as opposed to the character himself. And then finally, we want to attach the guy to the helicopter. And to do that, we can take our occupant and we'll say attach to actor. And make sure the occupant is set to the target. And for the parent, we want to use our self again. So I'm just going to copy this self node and put it over here. And we'll say snap to target, and snap to target, which means that it's going to snap to wherever the helicopter is. Okay, so now that we have this function written, we can come back to our third-person character. And after we set the collision profile, we want to enter the helicopter. So let's say occupied helicopter. And we'll call our enter function. And we're going to pass ourself as the player. So again, get ref to self. And I'm just going to leave this empty right now. And I think that will work. Hopefully it doesn't break everything. No, it's not going to let me. Okay. So we need to assign something to this real quick. So to do this, just drag off and type create event. Actually, no, that's not what we want. Drag off this, say add custom event. This is the one we want, add custom event. So what that will do is we'll create a new event, just like any other event. But this event's going to get called whenever the player exits the helicopter. Or that's at least what it will do once we code it to do that. So I'm just going to rename this to on exit. And so inside of here, we need to do, basically we just want to undo whatever we did before he got into the helicopter. And all we did in this tutorial is we just changed his collision to no collision. So we just want to change his collision back so he can walk around again. So copy this. Oops, that was not the right button. Copy that, paste it. And we want to set the collision back to pawn. Because if you look at the capsule component, by default, it is pawn. If you have it set to something else, then you'll want to set it back to whatever it was here. But by default, it's just pawn. And then the other thing we want to do is we want to set this occupied helicopter to nothing because we're no longer occupying a helicopter. So if we just drag this in and select set, and then we just don't pass anything, it's going to set it back to essentially invalid. And then that does remind me, we should come back here to the beginning, and whenever they elect to enter a helicopter, we should just make sure that they're not already in one, because that would kind of get weird if they tried to enter one while they were already in one. So real quick, just drag in this occupied helicopter and say is valid, and we're going to use this little macro, hook that up, and we want to drag off the is not valid. Make sure you do the is not valid and not the is valid. So this is basically just saying, hey, they pressed the F key to enter a helicopter. Are they not already in one? And if that's the case, then we'll go ahead and try to enter it. But if the player's already inside of a helicopter, it's just going to stop, because obviously that doesn't make any sense. All right, so I think this is good. If we go ahead and run it now, we should at least be able to get in the helicopter. There's going to be a few things that are kind of wonky, but we can fix that. So we walk up and we press F. Well, we are technically in the helicopter. If I press, actually I can't press F8 because we're in this view, but let me rerun this from this window so I can eject. So if I press F to get in, and then I press F8 to kind of eject and see what's going on, you see our character is attaching to the helicopter, and he actually is possessing it. But the problem is that he's attaching to the origin of the helicopter, because again, if you look at the helicopter, the origin is, well, it doesn't really show, but the origin's like down here below the helicopter. So obviously we don't want that. We want him attaching to the seat. And to do that, we can make use of these sockets again. So these two sockets were imported with the FBX file, but you can actually add your own sockets really easily by hitting this create socket button. So let's go ahead and do that. And we'll call it pilot seat. And then you can just drag it to wherever you want. So I'm just going to drag it into the pilot seat, more or less. I'm just going to kind of do this kind of quickly. Feel free to do this better than I'm doing it. That looks pretty close. So now when we attach the player to the helicopter, we can specify we want to attach him to the pilot seat. So if we come back to our helicopter and our attach right here, we can change the socket name from none to pilot underscore seat, or whatever you named your socket. And if we save this all and press play, oops, let me play it from this window again. Press play, and then we press F8. You can kind of already see because of his feet. He's now kind of in the right spot. Well, he is in the right spot, but he's in a he's still standing. And ideally, we would like to have him sitting. If you have a sitting animation already, then go ahead and use that. If you don't, I can show you how to make one real quick. It's going to be pretty simple, because ideally you would have an animator or something make you an animation, but there is a way to just really quickly hack one together. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick so it looks a little nicer. And to do that, we need to find the mesh that this guy uses. So if you go to the third person character and then you select the mesh, and then you can hit this little magnifying glass next to the skeletal mesh, and it will bring you to it. Then we're going to open this guy up. And then inside of here, we're going to modify him to make it look like he's sitting, and then we're going to save that as its own animation. So let's see. So the first thing we want to do is we want to move the legs so that they're kind of in a more sitting orientation. So I think if we grab the thigh L and we rotate it like so, 90 degrees, we'll do the same thing for the thigh R. And again, I'm just going to do this kind of quickly. You can spend more time doing this on your project, but just to kind of get the point across. And then we want the knees. Where are the knees? I guess they're called calves. We want them to be kind of bent like this. Let's do 80 degrees and 80 degrees. And then maybe we want the shoulders to be down a little bit. Actually, let's rotate them back. The spine one, I'm just going to sit them back a little bit. And where are the arms? Upper arm, yeah, let's make them more like this. And this. Oops, that's not the right one. Upper arm. All right, that's good enough. You can play around with it more and get his hands in the right spot and all that jazz, but that's the idea. So once you get it to the position you want, you can just come here and say create asset, and then create animation, and then select current pose. So we're creating an animation from the current pose, and then this one is going to pop up and asks, hey, where do you want to put this? I'm just going to put it right here in the content directory, and we'll call this sit underscore anim, and hit OK. All right, so now we have our sitting animation, but we need to actually hook it up so that when he's in the helicopter, he's playing this animation. And to do that, we need to go back to our third person character, and we need to edit his animation blueprint. So if we select the mesh again, and above where we selected before, there's this anim class, and currently it's set to our third person anim blueprint. you hit the magnifying glass, it will bring you to the animation blueprint that's associated with your character. We want to double click on this to open it up. And inside of here, if we go to the event graph, we basically want to, inside of here, figure out if the player is currently in a helicopter and save that as a Boolean for true or false. So I'm going to clean this up a little bit just so it's a little bit easier to work with. So let's take this try get pawn owner, and then the first thing we want to do is we want to cast to our third person character, or whatever type of character you're using in your game. You want to cast it to that. And doing this is going to allow us to get access to variables inside of our character. So that's the first thing we want to do, so hook that up. And then I'm just going to hook this guy into here and make a reroute node and just use this guy in every place that we're using the other node. So drag this guy over here. Okay. So now we have access to our actual character. And oh man, they really did a really bad job with this. I'm just going to delete these comments to try to give us some more room here and just kind of squeeze things together. I'm not actually changing things. I'm just trying to get it a little better organized so you can see what's going on here. Because this is kind of a mess. Drag this up, make a little reroute node. Okay, so all I've done here, again, is I've just added this little cast at the beginning, and we're just using that cast instead of the thing that was there before. And the reason I did this is so at the end here, we can write our own code to check if the player is in a helicopter and set a variable. So if we drag out of this, which is our player, we want to check if that occupied helicopter or occupied vehicle or whatever we set it to is set to anything. So if we search for get occupied helicopter, and we drag off this, and we say is valid. So if the occupied helicopter is valid, that means we're currently inside of a helicopter. So we can right click on this and say promote to variable and set it right here. And I'm just going to call this in vehicle question mark. So again, we're getting the player, we're getting the occupied helicopter, we're checking if it's valid, and if it is, then we're setting in vehicle to true, and if it's not, then we're setting in vehicle to false. All right, so that's all fine and dandy, but there's still nothing that's actually telling him to play that animation that we created. So to do that, we need to come back to the player's animation graph. And you can see right here, it's just taking this default state machine and it's plugging it directly into the output pose. But what we want to do is make it so that it only uses this if he's on the ground walking around, right? So I'm going to drag this down a little bit, and I'm going to drag in our sit animation. And we could just hook it up like this, but then he's just always going to be sitting. You see, if I play it, he's just always sitting. So we want to add some sort of condition in here that says if I'm in a helicopter, use the top one. If I'm not in a helicopter, then use the bottom one. And to do that, there's a handy little node called blend poses by bool. Blend poses by bool. So go ahead and select that. And the bool that we want to use is our in vehicle, so you can just drag that in. And so it's basically saying if in vehicle is true, then use whatever animation we pass here. If it's false, use whatever animation we pass here. So if it's true, we want to pass in our sit animation, and if it's false, we want to pass in our default. And we can hook that up to the output and compile and save. All right, so now I'm just going to save everything real quick. If we come back to our third person, or I guess if we just come back and run it here, I think we have everything set up. If we come over here and press F, well, that's a good sign. We can no longer see our feet. If we press F8 and zoom around, you can see he is in the chair. And again, I didn't do this perfect. His feet are kind of through the ground. You might want to raise it up a little bit and make him lean back a little bit more and fix his hands. But again, you can do that. You can spend as much time as you want tweaking it. Or even better, you could get an animator to make you an animation for when he's sitting inside of this thing. But this is good enough for right now. It gets the point across, I think. Okay, so now that we have him in the vehicle, we want to be able to make it so that he can get out of the vehicle by pressing F. Because you can see if you try to press F right now to get out, it doesn't do anything. And we'll fix the camera angle later as well. But for now, let's just focus on getting him in and out of the vehicle. So to do that, we need to actually go to the helicopter blueprint. Because if you think about it, when he's inside of the helicopter, he's not going to be able to, like any type of input events that you have inside of here, which is the character's blueprint, any inputs events you have inside here are not going to get called because he's not possessing the character anymore. he's possessing the helicopter. So any inputs need to be happening inside of the character, or inside of the helicopter. They're the only ones that are going to get ran or executed. So we need to check the F key inside of the helicopter. And I think we can just delete these because we don't really need these. So we're going to add a event inside of here for entering the vehicle. So event enter, or action event enter vehicle. And again, this enter vehicle, maybe it's not the best name, but it's for entering or exiting the vehicle. So when they press the enter vehicle button, and we already know that they're inside of the helicopter because we're inside of the helicopter in code here. So when they press the enter vehicle button, we just want to call an exit function. So I'm going to create an exit function as well. I'm going to call this exit. And the exit function doesn't need any parameters. Actually, this is going to be a good time. We should probably separate these. I like to do this. So we have this enter event, which is actually a public event because it's being called from outside of the class. And then we have this exit that's private because it's being called from inside. And you can set those access specifiers up here. You don't have to do this, but it makes the code a lot cleaner. We're going to set this one to private, and I'm going to add it to a private category. And then I'm going to set enter to public, and it's already set to public by default. And you can see on the left here, now we have our public functions and our private functions. And so this way, people at a glance can see, okay, enter is going to be called publicly, but exit is only going to be called privately from inside the class. So they can kind of get an idea of how this class is supposed to be used by, other people. But anyways, so we need to write this exit event. So inside of here, we kind of want to do the opposite of whatever we did inside of the enter event. So the first thing we want to do is we want to detach the player from the helicopter. So we'll drag in our occupant and we'll say detach from actor. And we want to set all of these to keep world so that he keeps his world position. Oops, keep world. And then if we just do this by itself, he's going to detach right in the center of the helicopter and kind of fall out of the middle of the helicopter. But we don't really want that. We want him to kind of pop out, on the pilot side or right outside the door. So to do that, we can use our left enter box's location, because if you remember, that's over here to the left. So if we pop him out right here, then it'll look pretty good. So back in our exit function, if we drag in our enter box and say get world location, and then we copy paste our occupant, we can say set actor location, or set actor location, and the location is going to be our enter box left. So that's going to pop him out on the left side of the helicopter. And then finally, we want to repossess the player again. So we'll say get controller. We want to call possess. And this time we want to possess our occupant, or that character again. So we'll hook that up. So that's going to make it so that we can walk around with the character again, and all keyboard and mouse or controller input will go to the player and not the helicopter. And then finally, we want to call this onExited event dispatcher that we made a while ago. So I'll try to explain it a little better. So if you drag this in, you'll get some options here, and we want to use the call option. Oops, I selected the wrong one. We want to use the call option, so select call, and we'll hook this up. And what this is going to ultimately do is it's going to call whatever function is passed to the enter event right here. Because remember, we bound to it. Whatever they pass to the enter event, we bound to it. And then in the exit, we're calling it. And if you remember, in our third-person character, the function we're passing in, or the event we're passing in, is this event. So whenever we call this is going to get called. So it's going to go straight from onExited to this function. And then back over here, again, we're setting the collision back, and then we're setting the occupied helicopter to null. All right, so I think that's all we need to do to be able to exit the vehicle. So compile, save. All right, so if we press F, he's in the vehicle, and if we press F again, oh, why did he not get out? Did I mess something up? Oh, we're not actually calling this exit. So back in our event graph, when enter vehicle is pressed, we're going to call exit. Okay, try this again. Press F, he gets in. Press F again, and he hops out, just like that. And again, we'll fix the camera here in a second, and we'll get it flying here. But this is probably a good spot to end this section of the tutorial, and we'll continue in part 3.